All right. All right. So as usual, we will just do a very quick recap of what we would have looked at last week. So last week we started studying the schools of the false prophets, right? Basically, how apostasy in the area of education, instead of producing true prophets or persons who speak God's word, it's producing the opposite, persons who speak their own mind or speak the words of Satan, right? So, so we said that the title came from the, the schools of the prophets that, we find in the Bible that were established by Samuel, right? Um, and these schools are not normal schools. They were run off a blueprint that God gave Samuel, right, for the education of the young, right? Now, after a while, we saw Israel departed from the blueprint and began to seek education from the Greeks. Now, in today's study, we're going to look more on that part, on the history of that, right? Um, as it was in the past, so it is today. So, like ancient Israel, we began to court the world, and that, has affected our education or religious education, right? Then we saw that true education um, had the purpose of restoring us to the image of God, right? Um, yeah, so true education we saw was very much tied to the true gospel. And so, of course, we know that the devil wants to corrupt the gospel. We saw that if the devil wants to do this, I mean, all he has to do is corrupt our education system, right? And of course, as more of what you will see today is that the devil did just that, and we're going to see how he did it, right? All right. All right. So, so we saw that true education, in contrast to false education, it affected the and spiritual, and physical well-being, right? So it's not just about, book work. I mean, it affects the physical and the spiritual as well, right? Um, all right, so now we saw the three purposes of the school of the prophets, right? To serve as a barrier against widespread worldliness, right? A barrier as in, preventing it from coming in, right? To provide for the moral and spiritual welfare of the youth, and to promote the future prosperity of the nation by furnishing it with men qualified to act in the fear of God as leaders and counselors, right? Then we saw that, of course, our schools, you know, um, which are supposed to be modeled after the schools of the prophets, we're not doing this. They're, matter of fact, doing the opposite of this, right? All right, now we saw how the schools of the prophets provided for the physical well-being. So they had an important feature of these schools was manual labor, right? And of course, we also saw how the schools of the prophets provided for the students spiritual and mental well-being. They had to study the law of Moses, sacred history, music, and poetry, right? Um, right. Right. So then we saw when we contrasted the schools of the prophets and what we have today in our schools, see that they are very much governed by the maxims and customs of the world, and we're calling it Christian education, right? Um, Then we saw that this ancient school of the prophets had to be re-established, right? After the passing of the time in 1844, in Revelation chapter 10, we were told to prophesy again. And in order to prophesy again, we had to create a school of the prophets, right? To prophesy, right? And of course, we saw, you know, just that, right? The schools of the prophets were to be a model for our Seventh-day Adventist schools, right? The schools of the prophets were to be reestablished in our times, right? All right, so, all right. So lastly, we saw that true education doesn't just fulfill the head with knowledge, right? True education develops the power in the student to think and act, right? To think and act independently, right? So, I mean, that was a very, very quick recap of what we would have covered last time we were here. All right. All right, so on to today's material, right? All right, so so last week we saw that our Seventh-day Adventist schools were to be modeled after the ancient schools of the prophets, right? Did this ever happen? All right, so let's find out. I mean, I'm gonna show an excerpt um, from an article from the review in 1882. It's describing a school called the South Lancaster Academy. The school was later renamed the Atlantic Union College. So let's go to the screen. So let's go to the screen. All right. See what this says here. Speaking about the South Lancaster Academy, right? It says the course of study will embrace English language, mathematics, geography, human physiology, and hygiene, and Bible history, together with practical instruction in tract and missionary work, and the most useful of the agricultural, domestic, and mechanic arts. But of all these studies, the Bible ranks highest. A practical knowledge of the laws of health is all important. Pupils will be expected to take but a few studies at a time, thereby mastering them more rapidly. Right? So we see something kind of approaching, um, what we saw in the school of the prophets there, right? Um, yeah. All right. All right. So let's look. Let's go to the screen. Let's go to the screen again. We're gonna continue to um, look at what was happening at Atlantic Union College, right? To see if this school you know fit the bill of you know a modern school of the prophet. Let's go to the screen. Right. So by the way, a lot of the material I'll be looking at today is from the book um, Broken Blueprint. Right. So here, this screenshot here came from that book. Right. So we'll be spending a lot of time on that book today, Broken Blueprint by Vance Farrell. All right. So let's read what this says here. Two articles in the review explain that instead of games and frivolous amusements, Each evening, the students had taken a special course in physiology. Manual labor was scheduled and required 3 hours each day. 1 hour after breakfast, one after dinner, and another at night. Students were paid according to the value of their work. The daily schedule required rising at 5 a.m. Study period ended at 9 p.m. During this time, assistance from teachers was available. There was a daily Bible class, evening worship, and a weekly prayer meeting. Baptisms resulted. Students engaged in missionary projects such as sending publications to non-believers, corresponding with interested persons, placing books in libraries, and corresponding with isolated believers. The entire New England Conference was thrilled at the good progress that was being made at the new school. All right. It says by March 1894, aside from the gardening and housework, 4 trades were being taught, and 2 more were in the planning stage. By December, it was announced that 6-month courses in carpentry, and the giving of Bible readings would begin in January. During the last 3 months of the 1884 spring term, courses in canvassing, missionary work, and the giving of Bible readings would begin in January. During the last 3 months of the 1884 spring term, intensive drill in missionary work was given to prepare students to engage in missionary work throughout the summer months. All right. And down the bottom it says, Elder Haskell, Stephen Haskell, reported that during the 2 years of the school's existence, over 30 conversions had occurred. Right. Right. All right. So that was what was happening at the Atlantic Union College there, right? I mean, very much, you know, it looks very similar to what we saw with the ancient school of the prophets, right? They were catering for the spiritual, mental, and physical aspects of the being students, right? That was one college. All right, now another such school was the Hillsburg College, which started in 1882. Let's look at what was going on there. Right. All right, so this is Hillsburg College, right? Says the daily program was tailored to fit the new work system, right? As it was called, providing for 3 periods of labor each day. Each student had to work a total of 2 hours daily. The young men and boys were formed into 5 companies of 5 or 6. Each group had a leader, and the different groups changed work after several weeks in order to give them a wider experience. The faculty taught their academic classes, then went to work with the students. The influence of manual labor upon the students' deportment has been very wholesome, and in no way has it impeded mental progress, but rather accelerated it. Right? Trades that were taught included carpentry, printing, painting, shoemaking, blacksmithing, and tent making. Right? All right, so once again, right, see what's happening there. All right. Now, this wasn't limited to just United States of America, right? Now, there was another school that was started in Australia. Of course, as you know, Ellen White spent some time in Australia, right, in the late 1800s, right, early 1900s. I know that school is Avondale College, right? Avondale College in Australia, right? Um, let's read what happened at Avondale. All right. All right. So it says here, every morning someone would ring a hand clap bell, wake everyone at 5:45 a.m. Classes were held in the morning, and after lunch, the students spent 3 hours in labor. About a mile west of the school was the hospital, which was used to treat the sick in the area and provide an entering wedge for the message. Their first church was in a sawmill loft. Although dissatisfied members talked about building a church, they did little about it. Until one day when Ellen White told them a message that she had received the night before. She was shown the prophet Haggai, calling on the Israelites to arouse and build the house of the Lord. Immediately they set to work, raised the money, and built a church at Avondale. Over a period of time, a number of industries were started where the students could learn trades and pay their way through school. These include a dairy, bakery, orchard, and farm, carpentry, and poultry. Although the original food factory was located on campus in 1897, a separate facility was started in Melbourne. Over the years, the profits have helped schools and mission projects. All right, so that's Avondale College, right? So we see that indeed we did have schools um, where that the schools that were modeled after the schools of right? So we had schools that were doing what God said to do. All right. All right. Now, so we mentioned a few schools there, right? But there is one particular school that we want to kind of mention today, kind of focus on it. Now, I believe it was Brother Howard who mentioned it last week, right? Of course, that school is the Madison School, right? So we're gonna kind of spend some time looking at the Madison School, right? All right. So we're gonna go to the screen, spend some time on the Madison School. All right. So we're read this first, please.
Each day began with morning worship as the entire family gathered to sing, pray, and study God's Word. In studying it, they were studying an important part of God's plan of education for them. When spring of 1905 arrived, everyone worked hard to produce a large crop. Gardens were planted. By the middle of March, the farm crew were planting trees for a future orchard. 200 apple and a lot of pear, peach, and plum. Loganberry roots were planted, 1,800 strawberry plants were set out, and melons, squash, and other vegetables were started. You will notice that no mention is here made of team sports or any sports for that matter. There were none. The students came to Madison to learn how to live, not how to play. They wanted to know how to support themselves while carrying on missionary work at home and overseas. And this is what they were taught. Madison had no athletic field, no baseball diamond, and no football field. There were no competitive sports because everyone was too busy cooperating in useful work. Think not that this made the situation dull. They all had a great time, and if you think otherwise, you need to try it yourself. Spend a summer working in the garden, cutting and hauling trees in the forest, and helping to build a house or two. Not only will the satisfaction of accomplishing something worthwhile bring you deep happiness, but you will learn skills that will help you all your life. In fact, physically, you will feel better than you have in years. One of Sutherland's sayings was this: our school must not only give the student preparation for life, it must allow them to experience life. And Madison did all that and more. It prepared them to be practical, self-supporting missionaries.
So you see what's going on there. Doesn't that sound great? I mean, even just reading that, I mean, I feel revived and excited. Right? So they were taught how to build houses. They were taught how to plant food and all sorts of stuff. Take skills, useful skills that will help them through life. Useful skills that will even help them in the mission field as well. Right? So that was what God wanted. Right? That was God's plan for the school. Right? Right. 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 So what were the objectives of the Madison School? Right? So once again, we will look to the book, Broken Blueprint, just to look at the objectives to see how they stack up against the ancient schools of the prophets. So let's see. All right. So let's now look at the objectives of the Madison School. Right? Let's go to the screen again. All right. All right, so the vast majority of students coming to Madison expected to be teachers or health workers in rural communities. And they studied Bible, history, science, or grammar during the regular 9-week terms. Right? Short 3-week sessions devoted to practical skills like carpentry, cobbling, or blacksmithing were offered between regular terms. Right? The first year, Mrs. Drillard offered a 1-year course in practical nursing and hydrotherapy. Later, when a sanitarium was added to the school in 1907, this course was lengthened to 2 years. In all subjects, the emphasis was on teaching the student to be proficient enough to teach the same subject matter when he went out on his own. Right? The objective was that the student should be proficient enough to teach the same subject matter that they learned when they went out on their own. So which means that education had to be really, really thorough. Right? All right. All right. Now, some might be curious as to what Ellen White had to say about Madison and schools like it, right? Let's hear what the prophet had to say about Madison. Manuscript Releases, Volume 11, page 192, 93. All right, hear what the prophet says. Somebody just read this for us, please.
If any more students in other of our schools were receiving a similar training, we as a people would become a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men. The message would quickly be carried to every country, and souls now in darkness would be brought to the light.
So in other words, we would be fulfilling the purpose for which God raised us up, as found in Revelation 14:6, right? Now, Madison was so successful, right, that even the world was taking notice, right? There's an editorial in the Nashville Tennessean in October 7, 1954, that says that the influence of Madison College had been felt throughout the world, right? Now, all right. So it begs the question, right? So if we had schools modeled after the schools of the prophets in the early years of our church, then the question is, what happened to them? How come we don't have any today? Well, now, before delving into this, right, let us look at what happened to education in ancient Israel and how it impacted their religious life, right? Now, what I'm going to show you now is an excerpt from an article written in 1933 by a man named F.C. Gilbert. Now, F.C. Gilbert was a Jew who converted to Seventh-day Adventism, right? Now, the title of the article is Why the Jews Rejected Christ, right? So here we go. All right, so here we go. Now it says, a spirit of friendship developed between the Greeks and the Jews. An arrangement was entered into that allowed a large number of rabbis from Jerusalem to go to Alexandria to translate the writings of the Jewish scriptures into the Greek language, right? It was also suggested by the Greeks that the Jews send their talented young men to Alexandria for training in the sciences and learning of the Greeks. Many of the elders of Israel feared the results of such a course. They counseled the young men against such a procedure. These young men in turn argued that it would be an advantage for strong, thoughtful, vigorous young men to enter the schools of the Greeks, as they might influence the philosophers and Greek scholars to see the beauty of the Jewish religion. Many of Israel's influential men yielded to Greek insistence. They were encouraged to believe that synagogues where the children were taught their religion would not be interfered with. The former said that God would help their young men to be true to their religion, and the training schools of Jewry would have a better standing among the nations. Gradually, the Jewish schools came to confer degrees upon their graduates. There was the Rav or Rabbi, the Tenor or the Goyon, the Sadi, and the Rabban. It was thought necessary for the graduates of the rabbinical schools to show the marks of rank by wearing different clothing. The man with a degree must wear a particular gown and cap. Little by little, an educational aristocracy was formed, which was called the Sanhedrin. While the religious schools continued to operate, a marked declension in spiritual influence and power was visible. Year by year, the Word of God was studied less, as the courses of studies based on culture and philosophy increased. The curriculum of the rabbinical schools was increased towards intellectualism. As the years became exalted and God was less thought of, the rabbi was extolled, the unschooled depreciated, piety gradually diminished as form and ceremony increased. Right. All right. Now, do we see evidence of this in the Bible? Let's go to the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 23, we'll be reading from verses 5 to 8. Matthew 23, 5 to 8.
But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments, and love the uppermost rooms at feasts, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and the greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But be not you called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren.
Right. Thank you for that. Right. Now, those that made broad their phylacteries, right, were those from the Sanhedrin, right? Now, here we see Jesus condemning the pride and rank that this false education fostered, right? He said, be not ye called rabbi. Now, let's hear what the prophet has to say concerning this in the book Education, page 64, paragraph 4. Education, page 64, paragraph 4. Anybody read this first, please?
In the theological schools of Judea, the word of God had been set aside for human speculations. It was robbed of its powers by the interpretation and traditions of the rabbis. Self-aggrandizement, love of domination, zealous exclusiveness, bigotry, and contemptuous pride were the ruling principles and motives of these teachers.
Right, thanks for that, Brother Howard. All right, thanks, Brother Howard. All right. Now let's from the article that we read earlier, right? Let's recall some of the reasons that ancient Israel gave for sending their young men to get Greek education, right? So they said, oh, we want to get trained in the sciences and the learning of the Greeks, right? So in other words, they wanted to learn the things that the Greeks learned, the things that the world learned, right? Okay. Wonder if there's anything familiar there. Right. So they also said that the young men said, oh, it would be an advantage for us to, go to these schools. I mean, because we can influence the philosophers and Greek scholars to see the beauty of the Jewish religion. So in other words, they say, oh, we're going to go there to witness. We're going to go there to witness and win souls. Once again, does that sound familiar? They also said, oh, well, if we get worldly education and probably bring it to our schools, and the schools, our schools will have a better standing in the eyes of the nations or in the eyes of the world, right? So after we get the Greek education and standardize our education after it, our schools will be seen as quote unquote up to standard, right? Sounds familiar? Right? So we also saw that the graduates of these schools showed marks of rank, right? By wearing different clothing, right? Of course, different names. Rabbi this, rabbi that, right? We saw an educational aristocracy was formed, called the Sanhedrin. So, in other words, we saw that there were marks of rank, doctor this and doctor that, right? Now, do these reasonings used by ancient Israel sound familiar? Yes. Yes, because they are the same ones used by modern Israel, the Seventh Day Adventist Church. Also, as you will recall, it was the Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus to death, right? So in other words, because of the false education, their mind was so warped that when Jesus came and he fulfilled all the prophecies there and he was pointing them to truth, I mean, their minds were so far removed from truth that they could not even recognize that he fulfilled the word of God, right? All right, so right there, Jesus was in the outer court, right? So just as how, because of false education, ancient Israel rejected Christ was when he was in the outer court, could it be that modern Israel, because of false education, is rejecting Christ in the most holy place? Food for thought. Now, all right, so we saw how worldliness came into the ancient school of the prophets and its baleful results, right? Caused them to reject Christ, right? So someone might be asking, how did worldliness come into our school of the prophets? I mean, we read earlier about what was happening at Madison School and others, and we saw the beauty of the education. So how did we come to where we are right now? Right? One word, through desiring accreditation, wanting to be like the world. Right? All right. So let's see what happened with Madison, right? We were talking about Madison School earlier in the study. Let us see what happened with Madison as it relates to accreditation. Let's go back to the screen. All right. Once again, this comes from the book, Broken Blueprint, right? All right, so it says here, in order to meet the ever new and changing accreditation requirements, Madison was faced with a dilemma. Either go steeply into debt or have the accreditation agencies close down their nursing program and hospital. Madison decided to go into debt to provide new and upgraded facilities. But the large amount of money needed to pay off that debt was so massive that the school alumni and other friends could not raise enough of it. So the entire institution was lost. Accreditation was always a will-o-wisp, ever changing for more equipment, ever calling for more equipment, buildings and library upgrades had finished off the institution. Of course, Madison could have chosen to lose the accreditation, but instead it lost not only the accreditation, but everything else with it. Mercy. All right. Now, on February 6, 1964, the school board voted not only to close down the nursing school at Madison, but the entire college as well, right? But it was only the nursing program that lost its accreditation, right? The pre-medical accreditation had been lost earlier and Madison did not close down. Then it begs the question, what happened? The work that God gave Madison to do was far broader than meeting accreditation requirements, right? Now, in fact, the God-given blueprint forbade any conformity to worldly standards. Now, I mean, that is just really tragic, right? That a school like Madison that was doing so well was following what God said to do, had to close down like that, right? That's really tragic. So basically it went like this, right? So Madison got accredited, so its doctors and nurses could meet worldly standards, right? Now, these ever-changing standards call for new labs, upgraded facilities, new books, etc. Well, of course, these things are not free, right? And the expenses incurred by the accreditation requirements outweigh the school's income. So they had to borrow money and go into debt. And it was this debt that crushed the school. All right. So, of course, most of you would know that Ellen White doesn't have anything good to say about going into debt, right? Right? And she says in Testimonies, volume 6, page 209, that if our schools are conducted in the right lines, debts will not be piled. All right. Now, another feature of the false education that came into ancient Israel, right, was the granting of degrees, right? Now, let us see if that affected us as well, modern Israel as well, right? So let's go back to the screen. All right. So Madison speaks for itself and what might have been accomplished. Our schools should have little to say now of degrees and long courses of study. The work of preparation for the service of God has to be done speedily. Let the work be carried forward in strictly Bible lines. Let every soul remember that the judgments of God are in the land. Let degrees be little spoken of. Let the meeting houses that are needed in our cities be plain and simple and erected without expense. Let time and means be wisely invested. Now, in connection with that, say, there was an article in the review, 1882. It wasn't written by Ellen White. It says but it sounds like something Ellen White would say. It says the popular method of filling the student's mind with that which is not practical and hurrying him through a certain course in order that he may obtain a diploma is not true education. True education begins on the inside, at the core, with that which is practical. It builds up and strengthens a symmetry of character that by and by in afterlife will show itself on some grand good and noble work for the world. Right. So we moved away from what is practical to credentials. All right. Now, so the church began to court the world and to, began to desire and accept the high-sounding titles that the world was pleased to bestow upon its leaders, right? Now, isn't this the same thing that happened with ancient Israel? Yeah, it's the exact same thing that happened with ancient Israel that led to them rejecting Christ in the outer court. Right. All right, let's go. All right. We're going to the screen. All right, so I'm gonna read a little excerpt here from the book, Education, page 225 to 226, right? Now, it says here, true education does not ignore the value of scientific knowledge or literary acquirements, but above information, it values power. Above power, goodness. Above intellectual acquirements, character. The world does not so much need men of great intellect as of noble character. It needs men in whom ability is controlled by steadfast principle. True education imparts this wisdom. It teaches the best use, not only of one, but of all our powers and acquirements. Thus, it covers the whole circle of obligation to ourselves, to the world, and to God. At such a time as this, what is the trend of the education given? To what motive is appealed most often made? To self-seeking. Much of the education given is a perversion of the name. In true education, the selfish ambition, the greed for power, the disregard for the rights and needs of humanity that are the curse of our world find a counter influence. God's plan of life has a place for every human being. Each is to improve his talents to the utmost, and faithfulness in doing this, be the gifts few or many. Entitled one to honor. In God's plan, there is no place for selfish rivalry. Those who measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves among themselves are not wise, according to 2 Corinthians 10:12. But how widely different is much of the education now given? From the child's earliest years, it is an appeal to emulation and rivalry. It fosters selfishness, the root of all evil. Thus is created strife for supremacy, and there is encouraged the system of cramming, which in so many cases destroys health and unfits for usefulness. In many others, emulation leads to dishonesty, and by fostering ambition and discontent, it embitters the life and helps to fill the world with those restless, turbulent spirits that are a continual menace to society. Right. So here we see that in contrast to true education, in which the student strives to reach God's standard for him, false education encourages competition, where each student tries to get more than the other student. Of course, needless to say, this fosters pride and covetousness, right? Of course, I can remember my time at school, right? Everybody was obsessed about coming first, and getting a higher GPA than the other one, getting more than the other one, getting awards and this and that, right? So yeah, so that was false education, right? We were all embroiled in that at some point in our lives. All right. All right. Testimonies, volume 5, page 27, right? It says, our college stands today in a position that God does not approve. I have been shown the dangers that threaten this important institution. If its responsible men seek to reach the world standards, if they copy the plans and methods of other colleges, the frown of God will be upon their school, upon our school. Now, of course, I mean, accreditation is seeking after the world standard, right? I mean, it's a means of standardizing various programs, right? Educational programs, right? Now, therefore, that quote that I just read there from Testimonies, Volume 5, it applies to any Seventh-day Adventist college with accredited program. Can you name any Seventh-day Adventist college with accredited programs? Well, I could name a few. USC, NCU, Andrews University, Loma Linda, right? Now, if that's the case, then the frown of God is upon USC, upon NCU, upon Andrews University, upon Loma Linda, and other schools, right? No matter how much, they think that they are doing good, or they think that they are providing Christian education, the throne of God is upon them. Right? God is not guiding these schools. Right? No matter how much they advertise and tell our people to come to our school because we'll give you a Christian education. Right? God's throne is upon these schools. Right? Do not be fooled. Yeah. All right. That's in line with what we were studying. I'm gonna share my screen very briefly. All right, so you see what's going on there, right? I'm on University of the South Caribbean's website here, right? talks about accreditation, right? Just read what this says here. Accreditation and affiliation. It says the purpose of accreditation is to ensure that educational institutions, such as the University of the Southern Caribbean, meet a peer-reviewed quality standard as a higher education provider. Accreditation is your assurance that the university meets these standards. Then down the bottom here, USC received full institutional accreditation by the government of Trinidad and Tobago through its accreditation body, and that's the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago. It's also recognized as a teacher training institution by the Ministry of Education, Trinidad and Tobago. Right. Well, it is talking about USC meeting certain standards, right? Have you seen anything as yet about meeting God's standard? Have you seen anything there yet? We're talking about high standards as defined by the world, as defined by the government.
I haven't seen anything yet. Maybe I should scroll.
I don't know if maybe if I'm not scrolling enough, or maybe I'm visually challenged, I'm visually impaired. Maybe it's there somewhere. I'm not seeing it. But I'm not seeing anything that they're trying to meet God's standards for true education. Yeah. All right, so that was USC. What about NCU? Northern Caribbean University. All right. So Dr. Lincoln Edwards, president of Northern Caribbean University, has announced the attainment of institutional accreditation status from University Council of Jamaica, effective February 7th, 2018, for a period of 7 years. Right? Right. Right, so it says here, benefits of accreditation, right? Through the accreditation process, the institution demonstrates how it aligns its efforts and resources to deliver on its value proposition. Right? I don't know what that value proposition is, if it has anything to do with the blueprint that we saw in the Spirit of Prophecy just now. Right?
You know what you call this? Word salad.
Yeah. And get this last paragraph here. Dr. Edwards expressed appreciation to the representatives of the University Council of Jamaica, and by extension, the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, for their support and guidance of the university in achieving the high standards required to gain institutional accreditation status. So they achieved the high standards. Once again, I ask, high standards as defined by who? As defined by the world. Okay, what about Andrews University? I'm sharing my screen here. We see here that they are accredited, right? ATS accredited. What's that? It's the Association of Theological Schools. All right. So they are accredited. Right, so the ATS is an association of theological schools. Who are the members? Member schools, from what we see here, member schools include Protestant, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and the Jewish graduate schools of theology, and reflect a broad spectrum of doctrinal, ecclesiastical, and theological perspectives. So basically the daughters of Babylon, right? There's more. All right. So this is the preamble to standards of accreditation. Let's read what this paragraph says here. All right. All right. It says, it acknowledges the centrality of the unique mission of each individual school while also recognizing that there is more that brings us together than separates us. Interesting. Right? So basically what you're saying here is that there is more that brings us together with the daughters of Babylon than separates us. Now, what does the prophet say in Counsels for the Church, page 58, paragraph 4? It says that by the first, second, and third angels' messages, God has separated us from the churches and from the world, right? Now, if the accreditation agency recognizes that we have more in common with them than separates us, and the third angel message, first, second, and third angels' messages separates us from them, then in order for this statement to be true, then what has to go? The first, second, and third angels' messages, right? Right, so under the system of accreditation, there is no place for the first, second, and third angels' messages, right? That is why our curriculum is like that. That is why our pastors are coming out the way they are coming out, right? We have adopted worldly standards. High standard, the world standards. So we see it clearly in black and white that they are aspiring go after the world standards. In God's blueprint that he laid out in the schools of the prophet is nowhere in thought. It's nowhere near these people's thinking, right? And I'm telling you categorically, if it is that you want your children to get true education, these universities, you should avoid them like the plague. I'm telling you straight. If it is that you want them to be worldly, well, fine, you could go ahead, send them there. Right? But if it is that you want them to get true Christian education, right, avoid these institutions of learning like the plague. All right. All right, here's another word from the prophet, right? Now she says, before we can carry the message of present truth in all its fullness to other countries, we must first break every yoke with the world. We must come into the line of true education, walking in the wisdom of God and not in the wisdom of the world, right? Now, the prophet is here saying that in order to carry the gospel to the world, we have to come in line with true education, right? Now, this makes sense given what we studied last week about the gospel being closely tied to true education, right? I mean, they're like hand and glove, right? So we must break every yoke with the world. So this means that before we can bring the truth in all its fullness to the world, we have to give up accreditation and model our education after God's model. If we don't do that, well, we will not be carrying the gospel to the world as God wants us to do it, right? Now some will say, oh, well, if we return to God's ideal, we will not look good in the eyes of the world, and, unbelievers, they will not patronize us, right? Now, there are two problems with this thinking, right? And the prophet addresses them both, right? So Testimonies, volume 6, page 142 to 143, right? Well, the prophet says, some will urge that if religious teaching is to be made prominent, our schools will become unpopular, that those who are not of our faith will not patronize them. Very well. Let them go to other schools where they will find a system of education that suits their taste. It is Satan's purpose by these considerations to prevent the attainment of the object for which our schools were established. Hindered by his devices, the managers reason after the manner of the world and copy its plans and imitate its customs. Many have so far shown their lack of wisdom from above as to join with the enemies of God and the truth in providing worldly entertainments for the students. In doing this, they bring upon themselves the frown of God, for they mislead the youth and do a work for Satan. This work, with all its results, they must meet at the bar of God of mercy. Right? Now, somebody shared a video with me some months back about some amusements at USC. Right? When I watched that video, I couldn't tell the difference between that and a dance, a fit. Right? So worldly amusements, right? So that is what's going on at USC, right? So the throne of God is on USC. Now, do we see here that Satan, through leaders and administrators, may use these kind of arguments to prevent the schools from attaining the object from which it was designed, and thus prevent the truth from being carried to the world? Yes, I mean, that's what Satan wants. I mean, these leaders and administrators are working for Satan, right? All right. All right, so Testimonies Volume 1, page 560, right? This is the other side of the issue, right? Now, the prophet says, a warning was given me against lowering the standard of truth in any way in such an institution in order to help the feelings of unbelievers and to thus secure their patronage. The great object of receiving unbelievers into the institution is to lead them to embrace the truth. If the standard be lowered, they will get the impression that the truth is of little importance, and they will go away in a state of mind of harder access than before. Wow. So in other words, when we lower the standard in order to secure patronage of unbelievers, are we helping or hurting them? Well, from what we saw here, we're certainly not helping them, right? We are making it even more difficult to convince them of truth and to win them to Christ, because our witness is showing that truth is not all that important. Right? All right.
I have a small example of such a thing happening. I was in a conversation with colleagues. It was a religious conversation about God and church and the Bible. And one of them mentioned that she attended USC for her undergraduate studies. Prior to that, she was saying that, she no longer attended church because of the hypocrisies that she saw in church, and just different things that we said she remained a believer in Jesus, but she no longer attended church. And then when we were together alone, she was like, Limeri, one of the reasons why I have this stance is because about the hypocrisy of church, is because when I attended USC, one of the things that the school makes a big deal about is, not having meat and, not eating meat in the compound and different things like that. But a lot of the workers themselves ate it. And clearly it left an impression upon her that influenced her current position. And of course, it wasn't a surprise to me because I know that happens, but I really could not say anything. I couldn't say anything because what is there to say?
But that's not the only story like that coming out of USC, right? I mean, yeah. All right. Yeah. All right. So let's just go back to this whole thing about accreditation, right? Now, since around like 1910, right, when the prophet was still alive, right, we have been flirting with accreditation for our medical institutions, right? Because we we wanted to be able to turn out doctors who can meet the um, American Medical Association standards, right? But in 1931, the church voted to accredit our liberal arts colleges, right? Now, you see, when you give the devil an inch, he takes a mile, right? Now, this started a chain reaction, effects of which we are feeling to this day. Now, in 1931, the American Medical Association put in one of their journals that one of our schools was close to being blacklisted because it accepted 2/3 of its students from unaccredited colleges. Of course, those unaccredited colleges are our own schools as well, right? Of course, that would trigger a rush for those schools to become accredited in order to please the AMA and not get blacklisted, right? Now, by this time, our teachers were demanding that all our colleges become accredited because, that's the thing to do, right? And they were also demanding that they be sent off at church expense for advanced degrees, right? Now, the administrators of the schools were in agreement, and that put a lot of pressure on the general conference. Now, the next thing that happened was that the Association of American Medical Colleges made a report on our schools. Right, this report criticized us very bitterly for having our teaching to a large degree done by our own graduates. Right, so the report says that these men feel that we have, as it were, intermarried amongst ourselves, or incest, right? Teaching wise, till we're almost idiots and they make no bones about telling us so. Right, so to translate all of that, right, they say, in other words, they wanted to have more non-Adventists on the staff, on our staff, right? All right. So, of course, as before, in order to please the AMA and to not lose our accreditation, we had to bow to their demands. Right? So we had to, have more non-Adventists, on the staff. Now, even back then, right, in the early 1930s, right, there were faithful men in our church that recognized that if universal accreditation and degree seeking became the norm, our colleges would have much the same content as the universities of the world, right? Now, before all this controversy started up, right, this accreditation craze started, right? Our young people would just attend our schools, become filled with our message, and then just go out and proclaim it. Very, very simple, right? Now, but since this whole accreditation thing started, things started to change. And these changes were coming rapidly. So our young people were getting the idea that the chief end of schooling was to provide themselves with a good paying job. They were beginning to think that the only true higher education was to be found outside universities. Right, so just a little bit more history. In the year 1935, a compromise recommendation was made that only 2 schools would be accredited. And those 2 schools were Pacific Union College and Emmanuel Missionary College. But in reality, 4 colleges were already accredited by then. So that was Loma Linda, which got accredited in 1922, Emmanuel Missionary College, also in 1922, Walla Walla College, 1932, and Pacific Union College in 1933, right? Now, of course, needless to say, this compromise that, oh, only 2 schools you could accredit, this triggered a rush because the reasoning was the other schools say, oh, well, if these 2 schools can get accredited, then why can't I get accredited too? And what could you say to stop them, right? So the other schools should be able to have accreditation, right? Now, of course, because of this, each college accelerated its efforts to achieve accreditation. Now, it didn't matter to them how much debt they had to incur and how many compromises that they had to make or how many worldly teachers that they had to hire. Now, when you hire a number of worldly teachers, what do you think is going to happen, you know, to the teaching of truth and our message to our students? I mean, do you think the worldly teachers are going to teach them about fear God and give glory to him for the hour of his judgment is come? You think they're going to teach them that? Unto 2300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. The worldly teachers going to teach children that? Not at all, right? Of course, also, approval from the accrediting agencies required that school libraries be enlarged with many worldly books, that nearly all the faculties be graduates of outside universities. Now, it doesn't matter what a man believed or thought, right? As long as he had that PhD, right? He was the one hired to instruct the youth of our church, right? So once you have a PhD from outside university, you could teach, right? All right. So PhDs, right? All right. Now, by the late 1950s, right, many of our college Bible teachers had PhDs, right? And science teachers, bringing evolutionary sentiments. English teachers would introduce worldly literature. But the Bible teachers with PhDs started to bring in non-Adventist theological concepts, right? Now, it is the Bible teachers who are in charge of teaching religion to the students. And these are the students that later become our pastors, administrators, and whatnot, right? When our young people study religion for several years under these men with PhDs, their minds become molded, right? I mean, of course, they must please their teacher if they want to pass, right? If the young man is a theology student, a lot of pressure is placed on him to conform to what the professor believes, right? Now, these people might have gone to school with good intentions, right? They want to go to probably become a pastor or a missionary or whatnot. They might have gone to school with good intentions, right? To increase in the knowledge of God, right? They might have gone to school believing in the spirit of prophecy and whatnot, but 4 years at these colleges often changes these people, right? Yeah. Now, so of course, right now we're kind of starting to see how the false gospel came into our church, right? Came from either worldly teachers coming into our schools or our people going to worldly universities and coming back to our schools to teach what they learned. Now, what does the prophet have to say about this? It's where you hear what the prophet has to say. Fundamentals of Christian Education, page 535, 536. Right, so she says here, the light has been given me that tremendous pressures will be brought upon every Seventh-day Adventist with whom the world can get into close connection. Those who seek the education that the world esteems so highly are gradually led further and further from the principles of truth until they become educated worldlings. At what a price have they gained their education? They have parted with the Holy Spirit of God. They have chosen to accept what the world calls knowledge in place of the truths which God has committed to men through his ministers and prophets and apostles. And there are some who, having secured this worldly education, think that they can introduce it into our schools. But let me tell you that you must not take what the world calls the higher education and bring it into our schools and sanitariums and churches. We need to understand these things. I speak to you definitely. This must not be done. Fundamentals of Christian Education, page 535, 536. Of course, as you know, we all know, we did just what God through his prophet said not to do. We did just that, right? Now, what happens to those who seek after worldly education? Prophet says they are led further and further from the principles of truth until they become educated worldlings. Have mercy. Now, I'll submit to you that the majority of our educators in places like USC, NCU, Andrews, etc., are of this ilk. Sorry to say. Educated worldlings. Right? All right. So false education was brought into our church, right? But it doesn't end there, right? Now, in these schools, right? Of course, when new staff is to be hired, new academic staff, right? You will often have interviews, right? Now, during interviews of prospective staff members, um, enough is learned that the religion faculty encourages administration to hire the more liberal ones, or in other words, the ones that don't really hold too strongly to our fundamental beliefs, right? Right? Eventually, the department is filled with worldly-minded teachers. Over a period of time, the professors who exhibit executive ability are moved to higher positions. Such men become the academic deans and presidents of our schools. Thus, the school administration is eventually captured by liberals, right? Or in other words, people who don't really believe in present truth. Right? Now, the trend since about, since around like 1980 thereabout, right? Is for the general conference education department secretary. The trend is for them to like have, a doctorate, right? And other positions in the general conference. So of course, given the trend of, moving up, these people that we mentioned earlier will move into those positions as well. All right. Now at this juncture, we have to talk about a certain fellow. All right. Let me look him up here. Right, we can't talk about false education and don't talk about this fellow here. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen. I'm going to ask you if you can recognize him. If anybody here recognizes this man. Anybody recognizes this man here?
Is that Desmond Ford?
Yes, it's Desmond Ford. All right. Desmond Ford. All right. All right, so we have to talk a little bit about what happened with Desmond Ford. Right? Desmond Ford passed away about 2 years ago, beginning of 2022. Recently, he died. All right. All right. Desmond Ford. We have to talk about him a little bit. Everybody knows about Desmond Ford, right? Apart from Brother Howard, everybody here knows about Desmond Ford, right? Yeah, we all should know about Desmond Ford. He's an important part of our church history. All right, anyways. All right, so of course we saw how the false gospel kind of started to creep into our church, right? You know, through the introduction of false education, which was introduced through accreditation, right? Now, around like 1959, right, a man named Raymond Cottrell, right, he was an associate editor of the Review. And he did a kind of survey, right? He went around different schools and asked Adventist Bible teachers several questions about the prophecies in the book of Daniel, and he tallied up the replies, right? And what he found was that many of our Bible teachers in our schools were uncertain of whether our historic beliefs were true, right? Of course, the reason for this is that they had been taught something different at the universities that they attended to get their doctorates, right? I mean, makes sense, right? Right? Now, we're talking about 1959, right? So even at that time, many of the Bible teachers no longer believed things such as the 1260 and 2300-day prophecy, the sanctuary in heaven, and of course, Christ's ministry in it, which is the foundation of Seventh-day Adventism, right? They didn't know about the investigative judgment or even the inspiration of the spirit of prophecy, right? Now, throughout the 1960s, the situation just got worse and worse and worse, right? Because more and more people with doctorates from outside universities were hired, right? And you couldn't fire them if they started to teach false teaching, because the accreditation agencies would cause trouble. Because for them, academic freedom was the watchword, right? You couldn't fire somebody because he was teaching false teachings because of academic freedom, right? Now, by the mid-60s, right, Desmond Ford, that gentleman that we just showed on the screen, right, and he had completed his doctoral training, right, in Manchester, England, at University of Manchester in England, right. The man that he trained under was a man named F.F. Bruce, and this man was a member of the Plymouth Brethren Church, right? And of course, he would have implanted non-Adventist beliefs in the mind of Ford, right? Now, of course, we know of the situation that came to a head in Glacier View in 1980, right? Where Desmond Ford kind of came out with his beliefs, where he started to come out against our fundamental beliefs like the sanctuary and investigative judgment and 2300-day prophecy and what have you, right? So there were indications that there were other Bible teachers that shared his views, right? Now, to kind of, smooth over the situation, right? The Bible teachers at Andrews University wrote our present 27 fundamental beliefs, right? And despite protests, it was approved at the 1980 General Conference session in Dallas. Now, the 27 fundamental beliefs, right? I mean, they were worded in such a way to provide leeway to the liberals in our church to safely carry on their work, right? So there wasn't anything really definitive concerning our fundamental beliefs. They were kind of worded in a way, to kind of make allowance for, liberals, as it were, right? All right, so I mentioned Glacier View just now, right? That happened in July 1980. That was the conference that was held to discuss Desmond Ford's beliefs, right? Now, of course, when Desmond Ford saw the new 27 fundamental beliefs, he told the General Conference president at the time, Neil C. Wilson, who, by the way, is the father of the present General Conference president, right? That he could live with the 27 fundamental beliefs, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but to me, that is speaking volumes, right? If Desmond Ford can live with our 27 fundamental beliefs, I mean, it is telling me that our 27 fundamental beliefs is not anything really sound doctrinal. If Desmond Ford, probably one of the fathers of false teaching in our church, can live with it, and that is speaking volumes, right? Now, the false gospel or the new theology kind of got so ingrained in our church, right? That coming out of the Glacier View meetings, Desmond Ford was fired, right? And by the next afternoon, which was a Sabbath, nearly every faculty member of the Pacific Union College were paid to send a telegram to the General Conference president demanding that they rehire Desmond Ford. Wow. Right? And in the following week, a lot of the members of the faculty of Andrews University sent a signed petition to the General Conference president to rehire Ford, right? And these are the persons who wrote your 27 fundamental beliefs, right? Have mercy. Of course, coming out, I mean, Desmond Ford's claim to fame is what we now know as the new theology, right? Right? Some of which we would have discussed some months back when we were talking about another gospel, right? Now, despite how they might try to make it sound intellectual and advanced, right? The new theology is nothing more than a variety of modern Protestant, Catholic, and agnostic errors, which our Bible teachers were taught in outside universities and are now teaching in our schools, right? And presenting it as if it is some, intellectual, attainment, right? Right. Now, of course, throughout the 1980s, the situation only got worse, right? Not only was error being taught on our campuses, I mean, they soon started to appear in books published by the Review and Pacific Press and in church papers, right? The teachers and the students, they taught, of course, as you would expect, they began writing. Of course, some of these errors that they began to write about included original sin, where the concept where we are born in sin and cannot stop doing it in this life, and will not be possible for you in this world to live a good, clean, obedient life. In other words, you'll be sinning until Jesus comes, right? Another one is that the atonement was completed at the cross, right? Another one was that salvation by profession alone. So in other words, behavioral changes are not necessary. And obedience to God's law is legalism. Right? And Christ came in the nature of Adam before the fall. Of course, last few months we would have studied those teachings in depth in terms of their implications on the gospel, right? Right. And of course, these are the things that are being taught in our universities today, to this day, right? That is why in our churches today, you will hardly hear anything about the sanctuary, investigative judgment, and 2300-day prophecy. This is why this is happening, right? This is why our pastors, for the most part, are so worldly, right? Right. This is the story of how our schools they moved from being the school of the prophets to the school of the false prophets, right? And are now leading our people into false worship, right? False worship because we are now telling them to accept another gospel. Of course, we saw in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 4 that this other gospel is linked to another Christ. Of course, if we're dealing with or worshiping another Christ, needless to say, this is idolatry, right? All right. All right, so it's going to be the end of our study for today, right? This is how our schools moved from being schools of the prophets to being schools of the false prophets, right? The devil introduced worldliness into our schools through accreditation, and through our schools introduced the false gospel into our churches, right? That is why our church is the way it is right now. That is why, for a large part, why we are in apostasy. That is why this study has been crafted. Apostasy in education. It led to apostasy in the gospel. And of course, as we saw, the two are closely linked, because so therefore one would necessarily lead to the other. All right. All right. So that's going to be the end of our study today.
To the study today, though, I really appreciate the walk through history. I keep telling people of a truth that you could complain about what you see all you want, but you're not going to be very effective until you understand the history, right? Because this is much deeper than your eyes can see. It is deeper. And I hope that the study was able to enlighten some. I guess, we have picked up some of the information along the way, but when you see how determined and decisive, the General Conference has been in terms of implementing some of these things, accreditation come forward. And what we learn here today is that decision for accreditation was 1930, thereabouts. You're talking about 90 plus years of apostasy. We come in now in the last 40 to 50 years. we arguing about symptoms, but we're not understanding the depths of this issue, right? It was the major takeaway from what I'm trying to say here and from this study is you would be better served to go back into the history and understand the missteps that were made by this church and by individuals, right? Nevertheless, we still have a problem on our hands to deal with, right? Do we continue to support these systems? Do we continue to allow our children to go to these institutions? I have an easy job because I don't have any children, but people who know me understand that I will never support these systems. I have been a part of them. I watch my peers. I watch, I observe things. I even worked for one of these institutions at some point, and chaos, vanity, you name it. We cannot support these educational systems under the guise of Christian education or whatever. We just cannot.
You know what is so insidious about this thing, right? I mean, so from time to time, they would come around to our churches and kind of try to guilt trip those who probably attend secular schools. and say, oh, you're attending a secular school, oh, you need to come to our school, you know, support Christian education, support Christian education, you know, while their curriculum is no different from the worldly school. I mean, they are accredited, which means, you know, it's the same curriculum, right? Same worldly stuff being taught there. It's no different really. You may have some prayer and whatnot, but that is just superficial stuff, you know. What is actually being taught in this classroom is worldliness, you know. But the prayer and the devotional exercise is just a cover for evil. You know? I mean, it's so deceptive, you know. So you're giving us the education of the world, and then have the gall to come to me and tell me it's Christian education. You know? Time that our people wake up from this deception.
Another observation which possibly contributes to why we have observed this move away from learning of the trades and seeking accreditation and the type of quote-unquote degrees that are offered by our universities, as opposed to what was previously done, is because there has been a shift away from self-reliance. So the majority of degrees offered by universities, including our universities, are degrees that equip the graduate to basically get a job, to look for a job, and to be an employee. Whereas from what we saw earlier, from what Adrian read, when they learned the trades, it would have equipped them to work for themselves, to be a bit more self-reliant, and continue doing mission working for God. And I think that contributes to that change in mindset where we want to have jobs, the employees, and basically the university education is preparing us for that. So that's another observation.
Very well said.
All right, so I think with that, we could pray and call it a day. Thanks everybody for coming out. All right. So yeah. All right, so we'll ask Lee Marie to pray for us to close.
Dear Jesus, we thank you for another opportunity to come together to study your word and to familiarize ourselves with what is true. As we learn about your ideals for education, I pray that you would please help us in our individual lives to align ourselves more closely with what is true, what is right, and with the true methods of educating ourselves and our children and others. I pray that you would continue to grant us more wisdom in this regard. Help us to be obedient to you in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.
Of the Sabbath. And as we return, we'll continue our series on apostasy in our midst. Lord, continue to bless and keep you. Bye.